Hello, friends. My name is Bret. This is my show, and I'm live every Thursday. If you are new to this channel or if you're watching this later and this is your first time watching, come and hang out with us on Thursdays. You can see the Bret.live URL there. Basically, we're talking DevOps, containers, cloud native, all things Docker, Kubernetes, CNCF, blah, 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 blah. So we're taking your questions. This is another day where I've got a special guest, a friend of mine, and we're taking your questions specifically around GitOps. So I'm not going to help you troubleshoot your Kubernetes cluster today, although you never know. We can try some of those questions, but we're wanting to focus the conversation around what GitOps is. If you've been on this show in the last year, I have talked a lot about it. So we're going to get into some tools, maybe some workflows, who knows. But first, just so you know, this show is sponsored by you. Thank you to all 110 patrons that are buying me a coffee every month. You can go check that out over here on patreon.com/Bret Fisher. You can actually get this for free. Just go scroll down, click on follow. The nice thing is you'll get an email or an app notification if you have the Patreon app. And that's only for things that I'm bugging you about. So new content, new releases of maybe courses or major updates to things that I'm making, new open source or big updates to open source. So just the good stuff. None of the social constant reposting of other people's stuff, like none of that. So you're maybe getting one a week, if that. So come check that out. And I appreciate all of you who continue to support this show and everything else that comes from it. So that's that. Let's get to it. With me today, it's no surprise since he's in the title of this show. It's a good friend of mine, Nirmal Mehta from Booz Allen Hamilton. He's a Docker Captain. He's a distinguished engineer at that company and does all things DevOps, containers, and now GitOps. We're talking about that today. Welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Thank you so much, Bret, for having me today. Let's get into it.
Yeah, you're like one of the OG original captains and going all the way back to 2016 because like me, you were lucky enough to get into Docker in the early days when everything was new and exciting and it was strange and wonderful all at the same time and frustrating.
It's still new and exciting.
It's still, yeah. There are still plenty of new and exciting things, which is what we're talking about today, which is like sort of the evolution of where this is all taking us.
Yeah, thank you, Bret. Awesome that I'm on here again today. How many shows have I been on at this point? I need to figure that out.
Well, if we include like the live shows like the DockerCon birthday or the DockerCon thing, the birthday thing, like including the Docker stuff that we've hung out at, which is usually restreamed to this channel in some fashion, at almost probably close to half a dozen at this point. So you're one of my regulars.
All right. I think, is that like, yeah, does that make me in one of your like lists of some sort?
Are you looking to be number one? Is that what you need?
No.
Yeah, because like we can make that happen. Thumbs up in the video if you'd like to have Nirmal back, because he does bring great stories and experience. So
yeah, and shout out to your Patreon page. Bret makes amazing content, and he's fueled by coffee. So if you want more content, gotta buy him more coffee.
Yeah, that's true.
All righty.
I've got plenty of coffee with me today with my Christmas present from my family, the Ember mug. Because I don't have enough things to charge in my life. I need a coffee cup that has a battery.
USB-C?
Yeah, no, it's contactless. It's got its own custom plug, which is
wow.
Yeah, feedback. Why isn't this charging off USB-C or some other USB? Like, yeah, it's sad.
All right.
Anyway,
let's get into this topic. GitOps.
So people, give us your GitOps questions. I already see one. I'm going to skip ahead. Something about a GitOps course. I do not have one yet. That would be a great thing to have. I wish I was faster at updating making that. I think that the evolution of all this is eventually my main courses will talk about it a little bit, just because it will be the way we all agree that you should deploy your infrastructure. So, by the way, hello to everyone in chat. Sorry, I missed some of you, Anton.
I see a question that is like a great kickoff to like get this discussion going.
Sure.
What's the difference between DevOps and GitOps, and where does GitOps fit in within the enterprise? So GitOps and DevOps aren't competing. It is, you can, so in my world, DevOps is still cultural practices, right? Within your team, within an organization, plus technology. And GitOps is a technology that fits in with a DevOps or DevSecOps processes and team kind of collaboration flows and how you achieve some type of outcome with your software development and delivery. So GitOps is a method of using a Git repository of some sort or multiple Git repositories of some sort to be the source of truth for your infrastructure, primarily at this point in time oriented toward Kubernetes. But as this discussion goes on, I think we'll also start talking about how there's a potential on the horizon. We're seeing some movement around using Kubernetes and some other tools to manage the broader cloud and other infrastructure elements. And once we talk about GitOps, if your infrastructure is being managed by Kubernetes and then that's being managed by GitOps, then you're also managing your full infrastructure, including Kubernetes, with GitOps. But we'll get there hopefully a little bit later in this conversation today. So let's just say, like, disclaimer, this GitOps stuff is relatively new. It's been around for maybe a year and a half, if that. A lot of the software was still very kind of version 1 beta, like not, don't run all your mission critical apps just yet on there unless you know what you're doing kind of level of technology.
And I think that, like, the idea, like, most of these things all have been implemented and have ideas out there years before we end up getting a single term or even a tool that will implement that particular thing all in one go. Like, you can look at you could look at Docker, Kubernetes, and all these things as that, the result of that. Like, big advanced companies, Netflixes and Googles and places like that, were all using containers in Linux before Docker existed, but Docker made it accessible to us mere mortals. Kubernetes made the orchestration, Swarm, Nomad as well, but these orchestrators made private clouds essentially more obtainable to mere mortals, or being able to throw workloads at a series of machines and have it all automatically worked out for you, where they go and how they run and all that stuff in a consistent way. Like, that's really what the orchestrators did for us. And now the problem is that the tools that we had for configuration management are less important now. Not that they're not important, but they're taking on less of a role, because now we have Docker installing our apps and dependencies, and we have Kubernetes deciding where they run and how they run and how many to run, and so it's like all these previous tools, like you and I were talking earlier before the show, like Ansible. I was a big SaltStack fan. Chef Puppet. I loved when SaltStack came out. I loved that.
You're like a number, like the SaltStack user. Sorry.
Yeah.
I had to just do that.
I mean, I was betting. It was funny because SaltStack and Ansible, I was looking at them like in 2014 or whatever, and I felt like SaltStack could be eventually more declarative. And as an ops person, it felt more opsy. And so I went that way. And then, of course, the whole world went to Ansible, and I was, I was like, I was one of the few. But anyway, these tools came from a world where we did not have a system like Kubernetes that would take a set of instructions and then look, and really Kubernetes was meant for apps, but really when we get down to the core of it, it's really just a declarative automation engine to look at what your set of instructions are, look at what you're asking it to run, and then make sure that they match, right? I'm probably not describing that correctly, but like it's pretty generic when you look at the generic APIs of it has controllers, it has an API, and it stores these things in a config DB. And like those of us that have been around for decades, like config DBs, for your infrastructure are not new, right? We've had all these tools for decades now that implement their own way to configure. I used to use System Center back in the Microsoft days, right? It was essentially that. Right. It was deploying servers, managing apps, deploying things. in a very painful way compared to what we have with containers now. But
I think GitOps is kind of, so if you follow like the Kelsey Hightowers or the center of mass around Kubernetes, many of those folks will tell you Kubernetes is not the end abstraction for whatever, right? It's actually meant for other things to be built on top of it. GitOps is a very good example of, now we're getting to a center of mass or a center of adoption, or a critical adoption percentage, I guess, of Kubernetes, where we're starting to see Kubernetes being leveraged as a platform to build further abstractions. GitOps is like something that utilizes Kubernetes or fills in a gap on top of the Kubernetes abstraction layer. I could have said that a little bit more cleanly, but I think y'all are kind of getting the gist of this. But
well, and you're talking about from the top down, right? Like we're thinking of this, we're starting a conversation around the long-term problem of running an app on a server is more than just the app itself, and containers really only deal with the app and its dependencies, not the infrastructure underneath it. And we now have these ideas around container images and how images should be built in CI, and we version them, and that essentially our code should automatically become an image once it's tested. Like those are concepts that as people get into Docker and Kubernetes, they're realizing that their code needs to be auto tested and auto built into images, and the images is the artifact. But we didn't have that for all the infrastructure that you need to run that app. So eventually, someone who deploys Kubernetes, they end up with, a they have a manifest file for their app, but then there's all these things in it. There's leaky abstractions in it that talk about storage
and all those backend services that they've bolted into Kubernetes to make it work the way they want it to. And
proxies, storage,
proxies,
S3,
secrets,
create S3 buckets.
Exactly. So what if you go straight vanilla Kubernetes and you're doing anything beyond just like managing like maybe one or two apps on it, you'll get an explosion of YAML files, essentially, right? And there are tools such as Helm and those type of tools to start templatizing and managing those YAML files as versioned entities, but there's still a gap. And initially GitOps is to fill the gap between it is like another abstraction to manage like all those things that manage Kubernetes, right?
Yep.
And so that's what I meant by it's like an app that's built on top of the abstraction of Kubernetes. Now, what I was kind of alluding to is now folks are building controllers or other things that run on Kubernetes to manage the underlying infrastructure and other services that are not Kubernetes, but in configuration files that are Kubernetes-like, and therefore can take advantage of that next, the Helms and the customized formats to manage those YAML files. And then because GitOps manages the kind of reconciliation loop around those Helm charts or YAML, like Kubernetes YAML files, if you add that all together, what you get is a 10-year ago or 7-year ago infrastructure as code management tool, but geared toward the modern era.
Right.
So it's a very long way of saying like what was old is new again, but it's new in the way that makes sense for Kubernetes.
And the thing that Docker first and then Kubernetes gave us, and obviously there's tools before it, but the things that they gave us was a standard. We now have these things like OCI and other standards in the container industry that all tools could agree on. So now, regardless of how you build a Docker image, a container image, we now all agree on this imperfect format, but agreed upon format. And I would say that that's an agreed upon imperfect format is 10 times better than 5 different formats of something. And instead of starting at the infrastructure layer like Terraform did, or starting at the super high-end package manager like NPM tried to become the package manager of all package managers, it's more than just JavaScript now. Docker went right into the middle and said, well, we're not trying to reinvent the package manager. We're not adding another package manager. We're going into the world of like DMGs and PKGs and tarballs, and basically, how do I take my application and now all its dependencies, right? So we started from there, and we're working out. If you imagine that there's the realm of concerns of dev and ops, and Docker sort of sliced itself right in the middle. We standardized. Now we can all at least agree on that format, and then we're working our way out of it. That's how visually in my head I imagine we're moving in both directions with standards that every cloud and every tool can adhere to. And GitOps is not a protocol. It's not. It's not anything that I'm not sure how eventually we can standardize on it, because it's an idea.
I would say
it's like DevOps. It's just an idea of something.
Yeah, well, I would say it's a pattern.
Yeah,
right. It's a pattern of deploying. Initially, it was a pattern of deploying. It was tooling to enforce a certain way of deploying your Kubernetes configuration files for your applications in a way that forced that information to be stored in a repository, and then the repository becomes your configuration database, for lack of a better term, and everything is triggered off of that. And I think that one kind of paradigm shift is allowing enforcing two-way communication between the cluster back to your Git repo, to make the state of your Git repo match what the actual what's actually going on in your cluster.
Right.
At this point in time, it's nothing more than that. Now, with that kind of pattern established, you can start to do different things with that, and that's where we're seeing like both Argo and Flux kind of going there. It's like, okay, we've established, the Git repository is a center of truth. What else can we do now, right? With that, right? We have this reconciliation loop, right? And that's the exploration that's going on. So I think we have some awesome questions, by the way. Let's start tackling some of these questions.
So before we get to the questions, I just want to give a real quick example for those of you that are new to this. Let's give a very practical example, because I think someone asked about that. So to me, the simplest explanation of GitOps in terms of how it would change your day to day is that if you have Kubernetes already, you figured that out, you have container images, you're going to run them in Kubernetes, you are probably the person that creates the manifest file. And whether you use Helm or Customize or the new KPT, I've been checking that out recently. All these different ways to describe your application in YAML, essentially, or a template. And you now have that. You're probably storing that in a Git repo, whether it's in your app repo or somewhere else. We'll worry about that later. That's just a logistical thing. But you have this file or files that describe how Kubernetes should deploy your app. And you're probably using a kube control apply to do that. Now you are the person who has to do that, which means we don't really ever know if the YAML file you have in Git, hopefully you're storing it in Git, is the thing that's running in the cluster. We don't actually know, so we'd have to run some kube control commands to see whether you deployed it or one of the team members deployed it. And so someone might say, well, we want to automate that, so let's put it into CI that every time we change it, we just run a kube control apply against the cluster, which is kind of a generic, it just sort of blasts things out. You don't really know, you don't have confirmation. And so GitOps tries to take that at the simplest level. It tries to take that and automate it so that the cluster itself knows about your repo and knows that when you change it, that you mean to update the stuff in your cluster, and it will do it for you. So it's almost like a pull versus push model. It doesn't rely on a human anymore to run kube control commands. In fact, one of the hallmarks of GitOps is that you remove kube control or direct cluster control from people on normal day-to-day. Obviously, troubleshooting and setup, those are different things. But on a day-to-day, applications getting updated and deploying, ideally, when you commit code to a repo, if you have permissions to that repo or that branch, because now, like in GitHub, we can do branch control where we can actually say in GitHub and other tools that only certain people have access to do to master branch, or have commits go to the master branch, and it requires a PR, and the PR requires 3 reviewers, and all tests pass. Like you can now do all that in a lot of these Git tools. So you have that whole authorization and workflow for your code, but now you can do it for the configuration of your software code, and that to me is like the simplest way. So when we talk about tools, we're going to talk about a lot of tools today probably. When we talk about tools like Argo and Flux, at their simplest level, they're just a tool that runs in Kubernetes that looks at your Git repo for these manifests or Helm charts or whatever, and then auto reconciles your changes with the cluster. So the cluster is ideally always in sync with your Git repo without human involvement.
And it also can monitor the image, your Docker registry, an image registry. I don't know if you mentioned that, but
yeah, I didn't. It's sort of like an extra bonus feature. Yeah, if you don't,
right.
Go ahead.
I think one that was a perfect summary of it. It is kind of a hard concept to relay unless it requires a lot of prerequisite knowledge of Kubernetes to like properly explain GitOps, right?
Yeah, and you have to know the problem, right? Like you have to realize that there is someday. I mean, I have clients where they've now figured out Kubernetes. They understand how that works. They figured out containers. They've got them auto building images. They're going into the registry, and then they make these manifests, and they're like, okay, the manifests work great. Now, every time I want to do something, I have to go and update the manifest, and then you run kube control apply like that. Now they realize that that's their day job. And in the world of DevOps, and especially SREs, we talk about this thing called toil. Toil is that stuff you do all the time repetitively over and over and over. And it's something you should automate if you're trying to do more DevOps. And that's where I think the GitOps idea is like, okay, this is toil. We should automate these things and make it more intelligent, like you're saying, right?
Yeah, and one of the outcomes is it starts to make your Kubernetes clusters into cattle instead of pets, which, in combination with other tools like Terraform or whatever other thing is managing the infrastructure that Kubernetes is running on, GitOps plus something like that, some other configuration tool that manages cluster, gets you to think about the cluster state as the cluster itself, and it's what's deployed on there as a cattle cluster,
right?
Versus like a manually crafted like cluster.
Yeah.
So I think describing a real world example of where this might be useful might help people with their context. So imagine you're in an organization and you're the platform as a service, shared services. You've been assigned to be a shared service provider internally in your organization. So you want to provide a platform as a service based on Kubernetes to multiple internal development teams or business units. So one way to tackle that problem would be to just spin up, write some infrastructure as code, write your Jenkins pipelines around the infrastructure as code, and just spin up Kubernetes clusters for each business unit, and then turn around and give kube control access to every development team.
Right. So now the developer has, basically, well, you could
use
RBAC,
rights.
but yeah, they have limited admin rights on your cluster, and they can deploy it anytime without committing to Git. Like they can just run commands on your cluster.
Right.
And
just and you hope and you wish that they don't mess it up, right? That's your potential toil, your risk. Another way would be to potentially have a way to provide some consistency around how each Kubernetes cluster or a multi-tenant, multi-customer cluster is managed and maintained. It might have security tooling that needs to be standardized. It might have like naming conventions and all this other stuff on the cluster that should not be changed and is managed by your team. But you also want to provide flexibility to the development teams to deploy what they need onto those clusters. And you don't want to determine they're only allowed to have 3 microservices named, with, Bret dash whatever. You don't want to get to that level of abstraction, but you want to give some kind of way of both operational efficiency and managing the cluster, but also giving flexibility to developers. And also, you don't really want to give them full control over the cluster. GitOps is a perfect way to have your customers use Git repositories with templatized artifacts, Helm charts or YAML files that then get your Git repository for those development teams become their main interface to the clusters and what they're allowed to deploy. And so you don't have to give them necessarily direct access to the cluster. You just have to enforce some standardization around how they're defining the artifacts and some guidance on how that's standardized across your organization. And so long as they follow those standards or follow whatever you want, you can guarantee that their application is automatically deployed in that way in your shared use cluster.
Right.
I hope that's an example that provides like a real world use case for these patterns.
And the tools are getting smarter. So other workflows that you can have here, like you mentioned a while ago about images, is for example, I can have Flux. It's looking at files. Again, it's running as a controller in your Kubernetes cluster, and you can have this Git repo with all your YAML in it, and we're just right now just talking about the things that run on top of Kubernetes, so that really your container apps. We're going to get to actually new things like where it's cross-plane and your AWS tool that you just mentioned that I forgot about, but we're going to get all those in a second, because this is the idea of this essentially not just doing infrastructure creation, but doing remediation. That's really, I think, coming back to the GitOps idea that we are reconciling any drift, which is one of the big challenges whenever you do infrastructure as code, is unless the humans all obey your rules that you made up, like only I can run the kube controller ply or the Terraform or the AWS CLI, like only I'm the one that can do that, you will end up eventually with drift where someone else has done a thing and that thing was not in your config.
Or the system itself has
like autoscaling,
like done something.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So with with tools like Argo and Flux, there's two main ways. It watches a Git repo for changes in your manifest, and it can also watch images for a pattern in images. So maybe your CI tool automatically, whenever you tag a Git release, maybe you have this workflow in your company where you say, okay, when we tag release, our CI tool will automatically build an image with this particular name in it, like maybe it has a version, it's a Simver or something. And then these tools will watch for those and be smart enough to say, okay, you've got a new version of the image. I'm actually going to let the robots do all this. We're going to deploy that new image in the cluster, but then I'm also going to retroactively edit the YAML in your manifest so that your Git log of your infrastructure now correctly shows which version of the image, because that's part of the problem too, right? Is if we create automation on image deployment, that's drift away from what our configs were. And my config might, like my original deployment, this is kind of the whole day one versus day two problem of I have these great manifests or Helm charts, and then things start to drift as versions of containers get updated. But then if we're trying to set up the robots should do it. And I do like this whole automated, basically robots making commits and Git repos for me. That's what we're getting to.
I know. when you actually see that in action, that's a really, like, I think that's when it starts to really click. When you see those commits, like Flux or Argo, like committing back to your repo with like the image, the image ID or whatever of that service, then you're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. And, now, I think we need to show the audience some of the links to, like, there's two. Okay, let's just do this. There's two main. There might be others, but the two main ones that I've seen are Argo CD and Flux. Flux version 2 just came out recently. Argo CD is very popular. They're both open source. Flux is developed by the Weaveworks folks. I'm not sure who I think Argo's might be just their own thing. And both they have different feature sets and different functionality in terms of like additional features, but fundamentally they do the same thing, which is monitor a Git repository and an image repository for changes, apply those changes, and then make sure that those files in the Git repo reflect the actual status after those changes are applied, or if
Right.
something fails, it doesn't update the Git repo because nothing changed, right? So,
Right. There's more. Yeah, there's
Argo's
definitely
from
more.
Intuit. Thank you, Arpit.
Into it. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're kind of starting to work together. They're both iterating on the same idea around we want more intelligence in our cluster because people talk about like I run a kube control apply, and then what? Like if I told a robot to
Yeah.
simply type that command in with the same manifest file every time there was a git commit in a repo, that's not very intelligent. It might have rolled back because it was a failed deployment. How do I become aware of that? And so these tools are getting smarter at validating and remediation. And also we've talked about things like images might get updated, but then the infrastructure code never changed because we didn't, do we really want every time we build a new version of our image to go back into another repo and then type the symver number? Like, do we want humans to have to do that? Right. That's a question that they start to solve. And then lastly, we've got many clusters. We don't necessarily, the thing that I'm starting to work out is, how many repos do I need for all of my infrastructure, right? And how can these tools help me do stuff with maybe not so many repos, especially if I'm doing like branch control where I'm limiting branch permissions and stuff like that, because obviously we don't necessarily want an app with 3 code repos and then you have to have 10 different infrastructure repos because of the way the tools work, and you have to commits. You don't want too many commits. Like right now, one of the things that I'm dealing with is C mono repos versus distributed, whatever the other non-mono repos, micro repos. I don't know, but having all these different repos. If I have a bunch of stuff and these tools all need their own Docker file and their own manifest file, do I really end up having to have a separate repo for every Docker file and every because the tools will rebuild and redeploy every time a commit happens. And so I'm getting into the weeds of this stuff, so I'm going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But follow the tools. I would say start with Flux for a lot of people.
Yes.
If you're just the only reason I say that is because Argo is great, but Argo tries to solve more problems, and so it's got more stuff. And I think you could if you know Kubernetes and you already know containers and you know how to make a Kubernetes cluster and you're satisfied with that. Try Flux first, only because I feel like its scope right now is more narrow. Not that it's better, because a lot of people I think have shifted to Argo, but Argo tries to solve more problems. It's actually got a CI component, not just CD. It does multi-cluster, although I think I don't know if Flux v2 now does multi-cluster. I don't know. Do you know those answers? I don't actually know this. I haven't looked at Flux v2.
Yeah, so I would challenge that just a little bit. I would say if you're just coming from Kubernetes, it would probably be best to understand at least Helm or Customize, or probably Helm, because Helm is like it's like one more step closer to what GitOps is trying to do, right? So understanding that most folks aren't writing pure manifest YAML files for their services. They're typically writing one more abstraction above those like straight Kubernetes YAML files, and then they're automating the deployment of those things.
Right.
Typically.
Right.
And so you have to kind of understand, like,
you probably need templates at some level. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The pattern here is, I like the day 2 apps analogy, because GitOps is like I think it's week 3, ops, right? Like day 2, you're like, okay, I'm like automating my YAML deployments and kube control day, and at the end of that week, you might have some pipeline that builds a container and deploys using kube control. Then, week 2, you're like, oh, what I need to, like, I don't want to write all this boilerplate YAML every time. I'm going to use a templating engine, which would be like Helm or Customize. So now I have a Helm chart, and I'm doing Helm deployments with my CI/CD tool.
Yeah.
Week 3, you're like, I'm tired of like manually triggering these or figuring out how to use Jenkins to do that. Then you can hit GitOps, and GitOps replaces in continuous integration, continuous deployment or delivery, or what do you want to call that? The CD part, GitOps does the CD part. So
Right.
if you're using Jenkins, you're probably like, if you're already deploying to Kubernetes in a in some kind of standardized pattern right now, the part of your Jenkins pipeline where you're doing some kind of like Helm operation or some kind of kube control operation, that chunk is replaced with GitOps. You just remove that,
Yeah.
and then the GitOps detects those changes automatically.
It's
So
almost
that's a
like
weird thing.
to me, yeah. I think I imagine it as your CI tool now is much more strict into CI, and its final act is probably building, like it's built an image, it's tested the
Building and
image.
pushing an
Yeah,
image.
it's pushing the image to the registry with the official tag that you need for the next
Yes.
release or whatever. That's like its last
Yep.
thing, and then
Yes.
in theory, and
Not
it,
not necessarily the last thing, but if you're doing like testing after
yeah,
it's deployed, there might be some stuff. But the chunk in your pipeline that's doing the like deploy this new thing, that
yeah.
gets removed
Yeah,
by
because I think some
GitOps.
people will also, especially because Jenkins can do everything, so people build pipelines to do all sorts of things that it wasn't really
I
meant to
know.
do. So one of the
Yeah.
things that, like I see people sometimes where they think that, oh, I can just set up a pipeline in Jenkins that will be my manual production deployment, and when I click it, it essentially does a kube control apply. Like
Right.
that is what this is trying to replace, and it's much more intelligent than that. So because it has
Yeah.
to be, if it's a robot, it can't just blindly run a command and go, I don't know, may have worked. Good luck. Like, go check it out and
Yeah.
see if see what happened. Because Jenkins isn't going to know. Did it roll
Yeah.
back? Did it have
Yep.
image pull back off? Like what? What were
Yeah.
these? What were the issues? So
So
we've got tons of
we kind
questions, and
of
I know you keep
I
saying we should
know,
go
I
to
know.
questions.
One last thing here, just as a teaser. Maybe we'll pick this up on our next show, Brett. Once you have like a GitOps pattern or some really highly automated way of confidently deploying to a cluster, then you can start adding things like Flagger, and you can start to really do like the blue green, like what I would say advanced deployment techniques, right? Blue green AB, shifting traffic from one service to another, circuit breaker patterns. GitOps is one way of enabling the confidence in your CI/CD process to support more advanced deployment techniques, which is really kind of one of the states that we try to achieve with taking advantage of these tools like Kubernetes
Right.
and cloud, right?
Without the
So
heavy human involvement, right? Without
with
an ops team
like
standing
basically
there,
no, yeah,
right?
exactly, with basically no human involvement at all
Yeah.
in that whole
I
entire
mean,
cycle.
I was, I mean, how many times have we been like in the ops room where like I feel like I'm the monkey pushing the button, and then we just wait, and we're
Right.
looking at some monitoring tool, some separate unrelated tool that's monitoring the
Yes.
system, and it goes from green, and it's to yellow,
Uh-huh.
or you're watching things happen, and you all have to be there because you don't trust the tools to do anything
Yeah.
in an intelligent way. So if things start to go awry, it's not going to know what to do. You're going to have to rescue the system, and yeah. So this is really just another step towards that. I like how you said it, increasing the trust in the automated tooling to do the right thing, so that
Hmm.
you can get back to what you're trying to do, which is like deliver more apps faster and more
Right.
uptime and better results. With less
Trust and
people.
confidence comes from repeatable results,
Mm,
repeatability,
yeah.
and repeatability comes from automation. GitOps is a way to automate.
That's why it was always a scary thing when you did that one deployment a year of that
I
big
know. So
software
there's a
update, right? And it was
perfect
always one.
question. Yeah.
It was so
S-
nerve wracking.
Someone just said in there that they don't do Terraform automatically because of paranoia. That's
Yeah.
so Archimedes. That's exactly right. Like that. That's
It's a
exactly
symptom.
what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's a
All right.
symptom of a larger problem, right? And not trusting the tool to not break things, or that you've had drift and the tool will break the drift. So Archimedes also had an earlier question that I just want to reiterate was, how do you handle approvals in GitOps? Well, since this is Git central and since
Yeah.
it's Git, so whatever your Git tool is, you are limited. You benefit and are also limited to whatever its features are. So like in GitHub, I know you can make a new repo. Just put your manifest in those repos. Only give people access to that repo. If you don't trust anyone and there's like a very small team, that's great. You only allow forks with PRs, like the normal GitHub flow process, and then and you can set up branch controls inside the permissions of that repo that say, for example, there has to be a PR, there has to be 3 approvers, and it has to have all greens on the CI testing tools that integrate with GitHub now. So if you're not using GitHub, make sure that tool can have that level of granularity and flexibility if you need it. If you simply just don't need that level and it just has to be a whole, like, do you have write access or not to the GitHub repo? Like that's sufficient for a lot of small teams, or what I call solo DevOps.
So these tools, the GitOps tools, you point them at a repo and a branch. So that branch is your gate. So whatever process that merges code into that branch is your approval process.
Right. Agreed. Anton, I think we answered your question.
Lightning round questions. These are really good questions, by the way. Thank you. Arpit Goyal, I think we answered your question. So we use Jenkins to update Git. Argo CD deploys. No, so usually then you would use Jenkins to build your image and push that to your image registry, and any changes to your YAML config, Helm, customized charts, whatever, that's done in Git directly, and Jenkins doesn't have anything to do with that. Anyways, next question.
Question on YAML. Can we use MS Excel spreadsheets to deploy applications?
Yes, I've seen that demo. It's amazing. Have you seen that?
No, I have not. But I imagine that someone could make that work. But also, the thing about YAML is, since it's like when YAML was new to someone, it was learning the format. It's kind of like a Docker file, right? Where you have to learn how the Docker file commands work and all that. So once you learn the YAML syntax, hopping to a new tool, you don't have to learn that tool syntax for its config file. I come from a world where, like, the MySQL config file was different than the Postgres different config file, different from the package JSON, different from the gem file. Like these are all different format files, right? And I didn't want to have to learn the tool and then also a file format. Like, that's very frustrating. So the thing that I love about YAML is that it isn't perfect, but it allows me to have comments, better than JSON. It's a standard way for me to make lists and and arrays and nested scope. And it sucks that you can't use tabs and you got to use spaces, and that it cares about that. But I don't think there's anything coming out anytime soon that's suddenly going to make YAML and all these tools suddenly go away. I mean, some tools have, like, Traffic has a way that you can use TOML, or other tools where you can use a different format, domain-specific language and all that. Anyway, I don't know if you have a better, but I have not seen this. So, do you have a link for me on this Excel spreadsheet?
I'm sure someone can. Yeah, Google Sheets, Kubernetes. It was kind of a joke.
Yeah, I thought I saw years ago someone had a great Excel. Like, was this some years ago? Because I remember some guy doing everything in Excel, and his Excel automation was amazing.
Yes.
And it might even have been a Google Sheet. I'm not sure if it's actually technically Excel. Even though, so I'm catching up on the comments. If you're asking as a question, by the way, make sure you put a question mark in it, because it's hard to skip. With all these comments, it's sometimes hard to read over stuff. So I might miss your question if there's no actual question mark in it.
How do you handle secrets?
There you go. Yeah, you're on the same
page. So I think this is kind of one of the chicken egg kind of situation with these kind of things. So what I've seen done is you use a tool like Helm and something like external secrets running on the cluster. So you have to use a tool like Helm to get external secrets configured on your cluster, and then you use Helm to install the Flux and Helm operators on the cluster, and that primes the pump, if you will. That primes the environment so that you can use Flux to deploy the rest of your stuff. So you need a little bit of, like, that like I guess a battery jumpstart kind of situation where you have to kind of jumpstart, and then once the engine is going, once Flux is there, you can pull in the rest of the stuff that you want to deploy. And you only have to do that once at the beginning of your like a cluster creation, and then once
Yeah.
you have that there, and secrets in this sense are like, maybe Git credentials, SSH keys, things like that for the Flux tool or Argo tool to communicate securely back to your Git repository.
Yeah.
And there's instructions on both of the projects to do
You're
that.
probably going to have to solve the secrets problem way before you do GitOps.
Yeah. So with Vault,
it's not a GitOps. Really, to me, it's not a GitOps thing. GitOps assumes you have secrets, but because storing your deployment files, whether it's like you said Helm or whatever you're doing to deploy your application, storing those in Git forces you to deal with the secrets problem up front. So the minute you want to store your configuration of your app in YAML or some format like that, you have to have a secrets. And we can have a whole show on secrets and the different tooling. And we actually talked about it a couple weeks ago, where I'm not an expert on all the tools and the pros and cons. So people were asking like, Azure secrets, AWS secrets versus, Vault versus sealed secrets versus, there was another one that came out recently, and it was actually encrypting your entire YAML file. So there's lots of tools out there, but they are a prerequisite, because if you want to put even Terraform or any other tool in Git, you probably shouldn't store your secrets in Git in clear text. That's not a recommended approach.
I think in general, a vanilla Kubernetes cluster is missing some critical things that you'll still need to do to actually like use it.
Yeah.
Right. And one of those things is using a tool like external secrets, plugging that with your. Let's do another, like, let's put a pin in secrets and do another show on secrets, Bret.
The old way we all probably started using secrets, and and this is another problem with Jenkins, was that it does everything. So we could store everything as an environment variable, and so you could create all these environment variables in Jenkins, even though that's not really what it was for. And then when you're doing your CD by automating your kube control apply command, then you would technically have your secrets there. But now you're using Jenkins as your config DB, and it just gets. I'm not a huge fan of that, but people do it, right? Like if they don't want to have to go learn, AWS's secrets or Vault or some other tool, I get it, right? Like you just cheat for now, and that's totally fine. So so we get let's table the secrets discussion. Great question though.
So, after how many years I get a beard? One will never know.
Hey, thank you. By the way,
I was born like this.
You were born like that. You came out beautiful with a beard. Santiago, thank you so much for the super sticker. Santiago donated to the channel. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patronage. And that's what keeps us going, is those little contributions like that. All right, next question.
I don't know.
GitOps. I think.
We're past that. Go beyond the break. Why Argo CD doesn't deploy the Helm chart as Helm installation when we use GitOps model? We're not giving Helm chart repo, or did I understand it wrong? I think you might be getting it wrong, Arpit. Usually you point Argo CD either at a repo that has Helm files in it, or charts, or you can also point them at a Helm chart repo, which is a different kind of thing. Most of the time, you want to point it to a repo that just has your Helm chart YAML files in it, versus like a Helm chart repo. So you might have to change the way that you're using Helm. I think, if I were to put like a little bit of a fortune teller, predict the future, I think GitOps and like these Helm and customized tools are probably going to start getting a little bit fuzzier in the future.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I think they're going to start becoming more like one thing.
Because there's people that are like storing their Helm charts as a version thing inside of Harbor, for example, and then that becomes their deployment. It's technically an artifact at that point, because I think I'm not sure if it sits inside an image or if I don't know how it's storing it. Docker also has the idea of possibly putting compose files inside of an image and making that versioned in a tag way. The problem I have though is that developers are already they have this existing workflow with PRs and Git branches. Like that has become like I don't know a team that I work with that doesn't use PRs and Git as their way to make code changes and approve them, and that whether they do Simver or whether they're doing Git flow versus GitHub flow, or like how they do all that stuff isn't really the issue. It's that we're all agreeing that the pull request Git and Git plus Git model is like the thing. And to me, the way these tools are bringing stuff back to Git rather than your stuff being in an image registry, and instead of going to the image registry as a source of truth for which Helm chart version am I using or which image should I be deploying, like that, it brings it all back to Git, and I really love that approach because I can get just about anyone in an organization to go look at a Git log in a web page, right? Like you want to know what the status is, go look at the PRs. Like did the PR get approved? Okay, the thing is deployed. Like go look like that instead of saying what we all used to have to do was, oh, well, you got to go look at this tool to see the status of the code, and then this tool to see the status of the infrastructure, and then this tool to see whether the what's been deployed to the infrastructure. Yeah. Which cluster has which deployment updated? Like those are like let's bring it all back to the same workflow engine, and which is the PR process. We all make these very formal processes around like Jira tickets that all end up flowing into PRs and things. And if that was the same way we did infrastructure and the same way we did code to the infrastructure, I think everyone wins, right? Like we're living in this smaller set of tools. Anyway, that's just
and we're not saying that you have to do GitOps. GitOps is a very opinionated way of doing the continuous deployment of Kubernetes deployments. If you've got a process that uses Terraform and sends a message to the Mars rover and flips a coin and it works for you, go for it.
so this is a great question. Next one, Ronald's asking, how do we test infrastructure, techniques to test infrastructure? So if you're doing this where you're putting your infrastructure as code in a repo, you should now start building CI processes to test that stuff. So the very basic step one is lint it. Right? If I make a YAML change and my CI tool in GitHub is very easy, you can use superlinter in GitHub now, which like lints all the things. It's from GitHub, and you can then just the simplest step one is make sure that that's properly formatted and that it adheres to the standards that linter that you agree with that linter on, right? Because all linters are slightly opinionated. So yes, go.
Can I say my favorite Kubernetes joke that's related to that?
Yeah.
Kubernetes, where you're one tab away from destroying your cluster. Right?
Yeah,
so that's why linting is important.
That's right. Yeah. And if you had
bad jokes.
Dad jokes. Those are nerd dad jokes. But anyway, that's the step one. Step two is, yes, you need to basically have a CI workflow where you start to make tests where when it deploys your YAML, for example, does the app show up on the port and does it respond with the proper health check when you deploy it that way? So you're basically going to have to be deploying applications in a test cluster to test your YAML, your Helm chart, whatever it is, and then verify that the app is running. So it does get complicated pretty quickly, but I think if you take the patterns you have for your application and then your application testing rather, and then you maybe look at something like Kind, K-I-N-D, which is running Kubernetes in a single Docker container, that would help you. That's a tool that would help you in a single container inside of your CI, because your CI is going to probably, it's building and running containers essentially. So you could then maybe test that YAML in there by saying, did kube control apply work? Did it come back with an error state? Did my application absolutely deploy, and can I test it, within 5 minutes or something? Does the health check work? Like you can start to build that logic. I don't know of a specific tool that makes all that easier. I don't know if you know anything, Nirmal. Like no, there's probably one out there, but other than having Kind that automatically builds the Kubernetes cluster for you, and then
so there's Kind, there's a little bit more activity. I think there was a rancher might have been trying to do like a Kind K3S kind of thing, right? There's some tools that people use to test the Kubernetes API, right? Like testing their controllers and things like that. that's an evolving space for sure. I think we're like a couple iterations away from having like fully like Kubernetes within Kubernetes like testing, right? Where
Yeah.
you can, as a developer, like in your CI/CD pipeline, spin up a full like Kubernetes cluster as containers, test your application deployment with all of its other services that need to be tested with, destroy that the containerized Kubernetes cluster as the gate to promote your image.
Right.
I'm trying to type up an answer to Santiago. I'm just going to say it. So, um,
What do you?
what do you think about any recommendations on how to organize the project environment and clusters with Argo CD? So I would say one way to do it, and mileage may vary, is have separate Kubernetes namespaces for your different environments and different services in different environments. So service 1 dev, service 1 test, service 2 dev, service 2 test, whatever. Then you can set up Flux in those different namespaces to follow different branches. So if you have a dev test stage branch, it's only deploying those changes to those namespaces. And that's how you kind of can do quote unquote multi-tenancy.
Yeah, I think you could do directory too. I can't remember exactly,
yes,
but
you can do folder structure.
Yeah. So
that's also evolving. Like that is very actively changing in both those projects on how, like, what other options are allowed.
Did you already answer? Sorry, I'm backing up. Oh, sorry.
I know. I'm
Did you already answer the Terraform versus GitOps, or did I'm reading while listening to you? How do we differentiate between Terraform and GitOps automation?
Can I just say this is an amazing amount of questions, and it's very clear this is a very interesting topic to the audience, right? So I think we might need to, because we're at the top of the hour, kind of say, I think we're going to have to do another show about this topic.
So stay tuned. Watch my, I'll do better next time. By the way, I forgot to put out a Patreon announcement about you being on the show. So apologies to anyone was, but the next one.
We all know Bret doesn't want to know that, does not want to know, let people know.
I don't want anyone to know you're on my show. Yeah. So I'm going to do better next time, so that if you're all paying attention to my Patreon or my Twitter, like the Twitter, I don't spam a bunch of stuff on Twitter over and over. Like that's what, if I've got stuff coming up that I'm going to release or have a show, I do it on Patreon. So go there. But this could segue, this question about Terraform and GitOps could segue really quick into us just at least getting some links and some stuff for y'all to look at, because there's so much we could talk about. But we had a bunch of other stuff. So Terraform is one of the tools that you can use to implement infrastructure, and I don't have it up here, but there are these increasing number of tools, ideas around tools that could work in a GitOps workflow, where your Kubernetes cluster, or now your Swarm cluster. We should also state that there is this thing called Swarm Pack. I have not used it. For you Swarm fans out there, do this. Go try this out. If people have asked on this show many times, is there GitOps for Swarm? This is the first time I've seen one. So I'm just putting this link up here. I have not tried it. I don't know the team behind it, but they have something called Swarmsync, and it's essentially using Swarm services in a GitOps fashion, supposedly. I would love for someone to give some feedback in chat, or join our DevOps fan Discord server and come chat with us about it in the Docker room. So we're over here. You can see us all in this. Oh, actually, you can't see it because it's not showing up on my screen. But we're over here in Discord, Discord chat server, and we're in the Docker chat room. You can come in and talk about Swarm and this Swarmsync tool. I'm very excited about that. So anyway, that's one thing. Next, we're talking now about how GitOps is infectious, because once you automate this, and if the tool remediates properly, it doesn't destroy your cluster accidentally, like if it's a smart robot. There are other tools now coming out there to saying, hey, let's do more than just kube control apply for your apps. Let's maybe do other things and use Kubernetes as the central control plane for not just your apps, but also to control the things even possibly underneath Kubernetes. So now you have like a chicken or egg problem. What do you create first, the Kubernetes or the GitOps tool that creates the Kubernetes?
Yes. So we're at the top of the hour here, right?
Yeah. You need to go?
Not just yet, but let's. I'd love to make a plug. I'm a organizer for the DevOps Days Raleigh conference. It's coming up pretty soon. I put the link into the chat. Check it out. Uh, if you've never been to a DevOps Days, all of them are most of them are virtual right now because of the pandemic. But there's probably one that's local to you in your neck of the woods. Check out the DevOps Days conferences, and if you're looking for one virtually coming up in April, check out DevOps Days Raleigh. It's open to anyone to register, and we've got the agenda up there. There's some really great topics. There's things around some of these questions that are in the chat today, like how to get started with DevOps, etc. That's a great way to get started.
Yeah, that's a great point. And more content on this, accessible from everywhere. You don't have to be in Raleigh.
Nope. For the first time, right?
Yeah.
Don't have to actually be in my neck of the woods. But
if
you go click on the top left there, the DevOps Days.
At the root. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see there's probably one in your neck of the woods. I know that Bret, you've probably attended some of these back in the day at some point.
These are great logos, by the way.
Yeah. It's all like volunteer run. So
yeah.
Ooh, that Houston one is awesome.
Yeah, it's dope. Although they might need to change the shuttle to a rocket
starship.
Yeah.
All right.
So go
I
check
wish
this
we
stuff
could have
out.
like another hour to talk about this topic.
and we didn't actually talk, by the way, before the show about hard cutoff. So I don't have a hard cutoff, but because I knew we have, but I know you probably got to get back to work. We do have a few of these other tools. So other things you might look up. So the Swarmsync thing, I mentioned Crossplane last week. Crossplane is trying to be like the GitOps version of Terraform is maybe the best way to describe it. I'm probably screwing that up. I have not used it, but if you go to last week's show, we actually had a link from Victor Farsick, and you can look him up. I think his channel is the DevOps Toolkit.
And the DevOps Paradox podcast.
And DevOps Paradox podcast. Yep, that's his podcast. Another great Docker Captain who's been on this show multiple times, and he has a whole video where he demos this, and he loves the idea because it basically just like the GitOps that like with Flux and Argo, this tool runs on top of Kubernetes, but it doesn't automate the stuff on your Kubernetes. It automates the stuff outside of your Kubernetes. And then today, Nirmal just helped me catch up on this tool, AWS's controller for Kubernetes, ACK, not the command line tool for searching. But I'm going to put these links in Slack, or in not Slack, but in chat. So Crossplane, ACK, because of course, I mean, Amazon, rightly so, needs to have their own tool. So this is like the GitOps. To me, I'm going to say this is like the GitOps version of CloudFormation, maybe.
Yeah, so it's not the GitOps, but it's the Kubernetes. It's a way of using Kubernetes native artifacts to. Of course, this is AWS specific, but
provision, it's provisioning.
Yeah, instead of like writing Terraform or CloudFormation, you would write a Kubernetes YAML file that gets interpreted by this controller and then deploys those Amazon services based off of that. So instead of having like back to your diatribe about configuration format, different configuration format files. If you're starting to do just YAML, like Kubernetes YAML, then you could have a Kubernetes YAML for your Amazon services like S3 and I don't know, EC2 or whatever.
Right. So if you're only in AWS, then you could possibly skip Terraform then and just use this YAML.
Potentially, yeah.
Because you can always use CloudFormation, but
because it's Kubernetes YAML, then you can make a Helm chart out of it. You could use GitOps with it. So then everything starts to become managed by that. And I think Crossplane is a similar kind of take on that.
Right. It's it's obviously cloud agnostic, but it's like Victor was saying on his video, it's not near as there's not near as many tools that plug into it like Terraform because it's been around months, not many years. So although I feel like I originally found this over a year ago and I just never did anything with it. So there are places you can run it, and it's trying to basically these are all becoming custom resource definitions in your cluster. So your Kubernetes
Yeah.
cluster becomes this universal common way to manage and automate not just the apps on it and even apps on other clusters, but now the infrastructure beyond the
Yes.
clusters. And I think there's enough. I mean, yeah, sure, you could argue that that was never within the scope of Kubernetes, but when you really look at the basic stuff in Kubernetes, when you look at the API and how it has controllers and has a scheduler, it is a I'm forgetting the word. I need the word, but it's a tool that looks at a state engine, right? That's maybe what I'm looking for. Is a state engine where it looks at what you're asking it to do in a declarative format. It's looking at the state of that thing in the actual real world, and then it makes them the same. That's one of the things it's really, really
It
good at.
figures out a way to get the thing to the
The thing.
it figures out a way to get the infrastructure to a state that you want it to be in.
Right, because in my workshops, I talk about how like technically Kubernetes doesn't run containers. It doesn't ever talk directly to a container. It talks it. That's why you can run now virtualization infrastructure with Kubernetes, not just pods and other things, because it has all these layers of abstraction. So it's just taking APIs, we call them resources, and applying and using controllers to apply the difference between what you want and what there is and making them the
Yes.
same. And at
Yes.
the very basic generic level, it's like that. And it's
Yes.
to some detriment, it is very unopinionated in that way. So it's very generic, which can lead you to get into a lot of trouble because you're just
Yes.
that's why like I don't teach a lot of kube control run commands because they're convenient, but something you would never really do in production. Anyway, that's a whole nother thing. But I want you all to get started on this stuff. So I think we've given you enough links. If you look in the back episodes at Bret.live, you will see that stuff. And so we're going to do a rapid fire. I'm going to give us 3 minutes. Let's see how many rapid fire questions we can answer with a one-line elevator pitch kind of answer here to get some people some quick question answers. I'm going to only look for the question marks. By the way, thanks again, Santiago.
Bret, I've got to
You gotta go?
make my adieus. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It was an absolute pleasure talking about this topic. I don't think we got to all the things we wanted to talk about, but
as always, we always end our show going, yeah, that's it for today.
Yep. I would ask folks to put topics in the chat of future shows. That helps guide, maybe not even me, but next time I'm on the show, if Bret lets me on, we can have a list of topics that we can talk about. But
yeah,
thank you for the amazing questions. This is one of the most interactive sessions I think we've done in terms of questions, and it's very clear this is a topic that's on a lot of people's mind.
Right.
Around this.
It's the next phase, I think. It's the next big thing for once you've learned Kubernetes and you're using it, you're now like, okay, what's the next thing I can automate? And I think this is really it for a lot of people. This is this is the next step. So we'll have you back on. We'll talk about GitOps again, or maybe something completely different like Backstage, which I know you wanted to talk about Backstage.
Yeah.
But we didn't even get to it.
No.
So we'll look at that next time. And I will see you all next week here on the show. We're going to have another guest next week. And I totally don't remember who that is, but stay tuned. And this is why you got to get on my Patreon, because I will be doing those things over there. So another last plug for the Patreon. Go over there. Just sign up. You don't even have to give me a coffee if you don't want. Just click the follow button, and you'll get announcements about new shows.
And if you're a High Five patron, there's a special super secret group channel that you're invited to. And
yeah. And we hang out monthly. We do Zoom hangouts, or now we do Discord hangouts.
So if you want to hang out with us and ask those deeper questions on DevOps, consider becoming a patron.
Yeah, lots of cool people that are doing this stuff in the real world every day. So it's a fun group. All right, you have our Twitter handles. You can find him on Twitter at Normal Faults. Not Normal Faults, but Normal Faults.
Always.
And you can find all of my stuff above, as well as the links to my courses and all that below. And thanks again. We'll see you next week here on YouTube Live. Ciao.
Thank you.